Saturday, April the 3rd, 1982, Tzav, Shabbat HaGadol. Last Sunday afternoon, I participated in a discussion which I'd like to talk to you about. It was sponsored by an organization called the Radius Institute, which is housed in the Center for Jewish Studies at City University Graduate Center. The director of the Radius Institute is Stephen Shaw, and they describe themselves on their notepaper as a non-profit programming and policy planning center which stimulates interaction among outstanding humanists, social scientists, religious thinkers, and communal leaders, and explores the implications of their work for contemporary Jewish life and values. There were about 15 to 20 people present. Took place high up above Park Avenue in a resplendent apartment. I did not recognize most of the people there. Our own Charles Silberman was one of the guests. Cynthia Ozick, I'm sure, is known to many of you. Theodore Solotaroff may be known to many of you. He was a former editor of Commentary magazine before it went off. And is now in writing on his own. And the discussion was between me and a rabbi called Adin Steinsaltz, whom some of you may know, who has published 3 books in English, or I think they've been translated. He writes in Hebrew. One is a book of Hasidic stories. The other is called The Essential Talmud. And the other is called The 13-Petaled Rose, which is a book on Jewish mysticism. He also has translated the Talmud into Hebrew. Many of you didn't even know the Talmud wasn't written in Hebrew. Is that right? The Talmud is written in a very difficult Aramaic, which is the lingua franca of the Jews at the time of Jesus. And it is a prodigious effort to translate it into Hebrew. He has just accepted an invitation from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton to spend the months of July and June and July in residence there, and he has been associated with many colleges in America and throughout the world. There was a big article on him in Time magazine some months ago, which some of you may have seen, and he's a very interesting man. Of the many vignettes that I might, he's a man who generates vignettes. Let me just give you one, which was written in the Jerusalem Post magazine on January the 22nd, 1982, written by a certain Van Leer, who was writing a film script based on the story of Noah and the Ark, and wanted to learn something about the background of Judaism to help him with the writing of the script, and began to attend a study group run by Adin Steinsaltz. He writes in this article from the Jerusalem Post magazine, I met Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz some 3 years ago while writing a film script based on the story of Noah and his floating zoo, one aspect of which did not make sense to me. Not wanting to give the false impression of being a Chozeh b'teshuvah, a reborn Jew, I explained to Rabbi Steinsaltz that being born a Jew once was plenty for me. I did not want to be born twice as a Jew. Sympathize with that, don't you? That I was anything but observant, that in fact I had bacon for breakfast every Saturday. I also said something in praise of Israeli bacon. He looked at me with his blue eyes from which humor is never distant. Only on Shabbat? Only on Shabbat, he asked. I explained that only on Shabbat did I have time to make a meal of my breakfast. One must honor the Shabbat, he said. It would not be my way, of course, but it is a way. Continue. There you have the flavor of the man. This was a 15-round bout, 3 minutes each between. On the right, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, professor of theology and internationally renowned scholar, and on the other, a somewhat wilting Reconstructionist rabbi. It was a setup, the idea being that we were supposed to lock horns on the issue of supernaturalism versus naturalism, which of course, as you all must have known, was a waste of time from the very beginning. I had not read any of Rabbi Steinsaltz's book, which also rather complicated the discussion to the beginning. I made that quite clear to Steve Shaw. It is not quite true. I had read part of the 13-petaled rose in anticipation of this program, and I gave up very early in the book. I said to Rabbi Steinsaltz that I gave up a third of the way through, but it was a lie. I gave up on page 9, and I will explain to you why I gave up on page 9. The book is a very deeply mystical book which speaks of the world in many different senses, different worlds, but crucially about different spiritual beings, more specifically angels. Let me read the paragraph at which I stopped reading the book. I was perfectly prepared to, I've read much as difficult, if not more difficult people. I still don't understand Levi-Strauss, but I still don't give up in the hope that one day before I die, at least one of his pages will make sense. He talks about the existence of angels. I want to read a brief paragraph. The world, this is page 7, just before I gave up on page 8. The world of formation may be said to be in its essence a world of feeling. It is a world whose main substance or type of experience is emotion of one kind or another, and in which such emotions are the elements that determine its patterns. The living beings in it are conscious manifestations of particular impulses. Impulses to perform one or another act, or respond in one or another way, or of the power to carry through an incentive, to realize, to fulfill the tendency of an inclination or an inspiration. The living creatures of the world of formation, the beings who function in it as we function in the world of action, are called in a general way angels. Now this is the paragraph that I stopped at. An angel is a spiritual reality with its own unique content, quality and character. What distinguishes one angel from another is not the physical quality of spatial apartness, but difference of level, one being above or below another, with respect to fundamental causality in terms of some difference in essence. Now, as we have said, angels are beings in the world that is the domain of emotion and feeling. And since this is the case, the substantial quality of an angel may be an impulse or a drive, say, an inclination in the direction of love or a seizure of fear, pity, or the like. To express a larger totality of being, something more comprehensive, we may refer to a camp of angels. That's when I stopped and closed the book. One angel I was prepared to live with for another few chapters, but a camp of angels, never. In essence, Rabbi Steinsaltz's book, which is published by Basic Books, and it's one of the signs of the times, those of you who are in the publishing industry, that some of the most exotic and esoteric Jewish texts, which would never have seen the halls of any publishing company outside of in-house presses, such as the Reconstructionist Press or Bloch Publishing Company or Berman House, are being published widely in the most unexpected places today. Harper and Row, Basic Books, Penguin, Pelican are publishing the most incredibly specifically ethnic Jewish-oriented books. It's a sign of the times. I don't know whether it means that Jews are more involved in being Jews. I think it certainly shows that non-Jews are more interested in reading about Jews, because one suspects that the bulk of the people who read these books are not in fact Jews themselves. But we don't have many statistics on the topic. In essence, on the bottom line, and Rabbi Steinsaltz agrees with this characterization of his book, which one was able to ascertain even from 9 pages. What Rabbi Steinsaltz has presented in Hebrew, and it has been translated into English, is Lurianic Kabbalah, without apology, published by Basic Books. Now this is a curious phenomenon of the 20th century. Up to the 20th century, nobody knew about Lurianic Kabbalah, although it had an enormous influence on Jewish life. In the first issue of the Jewish Encyclopedia, published by Funk and Wagnall, you will find hardly any reference to Lurianic Kabbalah. In fact, you will hardly find any reference to Kabbalah at all. At the time when that famous dictionary of Judaica was published, mysticism and Kabbalah were dirty words in Jewish life. The fact that in the last 50 or 60 years everybody is talking about Jewish mysticism is in no small measure due to the efforts of one single human being who died a few weeks ago, a great scholar, whatever one feels about his enterprise in bringing Kabbalah to the notice of the Western world in general and to the Jewish people in particular. Gershom Scholem, in something like a dozen or so books written in German, later in Hebrew, and most of them translated into English, introduced both the Jewish people and the Western world, through his brilliant and profound scholarship, to ideas which are unprecedented in the modern world, and brought on the vogue for Kabbalah and mysticism, which makes it possible for a book like the 13 Petal Prose to be published by Basic Books. But I would like to see 50 people who have read it from cover to cover and can talk about it intelligently. It's a different thing. The curious phenomenon of publishing books that nobody understands and which still nevertheless sell is another phenomenon of the 20th century. Now, bottom line, what is Lurianic Kabbalah? Lurianic Kabbalah is a form of Kabbalah which was developed in the 16th century based on traditional Kabbalistic modes of thinking which go back to the Zohar, which is a 13th century product, back to the 8th and 7th and 6th post-Christian centuries, and also to the Talmud itself. There is an unbroken history of Jewish mysticism, but Lurianic Kabbalah picked it up in the presence of a unique historical circumstance, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the settlement in Israel, especially in Tzfat, of Jews who were attempting to explain through their mystical understanding of life why the Jews had suffered this terrible trauma of being expelled from Spain. And the Kabbalah, in essence, is what we could call theurgic. That is to say, it believes that human beings can alter the reality of the cosmos. Not just that we can cut a tree down, or we can mow our lawn, or we can put wallpaper on the walls of our apartments, but that if we perform a mitzvah in a special way, with kavanah, with concentration and intention, we actually affect the very substance of the cosmos. This is what he is saying. He is saying that when I sit down, for example, at the Passover table, and take a piece of matzah in my hand, and prepare to recite the 2 benedictions over the matzah, and before doing that I recite the rubric formula, which Kabbalistic Judaism, under its Lurianic impulse, because Lurianic Kabbalah influenced Judaism profoundly. One of the things, just casually, I'd like to throw out, Lurianic Kabbalah introduced the notion of Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi was written by Shlomo Alkabetz, the song that we sing in synagogue on Friday night, the custom of going to the door of the synagogue, or turning round to face the door of the synagogue to greet the Shabbat bride. In Israel, people go out of the synagogues, walk to the hills, actually leave the synagogue to greet the Sabbath bride. This is all Lurianic Kabbalah. It didn't exist before the 16th century. Many of the Zemirot, like Ya Ribbon Olam, some of us think that Moses sang when he came down from Mount Sinai, are the results of the work of the Lurianic Kabbalists of Tzfat. Many of the Zemirot, in fact the whole ethos of the modern Orthodox Shabbat is unrecognizable without the impact of Shlomo Luria, the Luria who gives his name to the Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, this notion that if you sit there and recite the proper kavanah, it runs, Hineni Mukhara Muzuman Lakaimitz, behold, I am prepared and ready to perform the positive commandment of eating matzah on the night of Passover, and in doing this mitzvah, I hope to perform the uniting of the male and the female aspects of the divine in heaven. Now let's understand what we're talking about here. The Kabbalist who eats that matzah, having recited the blessings appropriately, believes that he is going to actually fashion a better world, that the performance of the mitzvah on earth changes the cosmos. It's a literal change in the cosmos. Steinsaltz's notion is that when you perform a mitzvah properly, you create an angel. An angel has only a single task to do. That's why an angel may not be compared to a human being. But it is clear that for Steinsaltz, the angel is real. He made the point time and again in this debate, which lasted for 3 hours. That he believes that angels are discovered. That was the point. That was the point on which we broke ranks. He believes that angels are there. They are discovered. They are not creations of the human mind or of human society. You discover angels. Now, of course, there are many, many, many examples of angels in Jewish history, I don't know whether we are aware of what extent angelology, as it is called, is a central theme in pre-modern Judaism. As you might expect, the editors of the Reconstructionist Haggadah cut out all references to angels. Although if you compare the Reconstructionist Haggadah with the traditional Haggadah, there are many mentions of angels for reasons which we will come upon. Many traditional views may be cited at this point, simply briefly to indicate the role that angels play in Jewish tradition. Let me give you just 2 or 3 very brief examples to indicate the centrality of angelology in Judaism. Not in the Bible so much, but in Jewish experience after we came under the influence of the Persians, who also had a very extensive angelology. One traditional view says that every human being has a guardian angel. Another view says that every Jew is throughout his life attended by 11,000 guardian angels. Another view says that every single blade of grass in the world has a guardian angel, which watches over it and says to it, "Bubala, grow." These examples are sufficient to indicate to you that angels are not just a peripheral and marginal dimension of Jewish tradition, but are a central theological issue. And one may well ask, where are angels and Reconstructionism? I did not want to participate in the discussion. I told Mr. Katz that I wish he would leave me out and find something more interesting to talk about. Mr. Shaw, Mr. Shaw, Stephen Shaw. But finally, since this was the 3rd or 4th time that I had said no, Steinsaltz comes to this country on visits to various colleges from time to time, and I'd refused time and again. I thought that if I agreed this time, he wouldn't ask me again. So, the first salvo that I fired came from the opening of Rilke's Duino Elegies. Rilke wrote these elegies at a time in his life when he felt that everything depended on his next piece of poetic activity. He had written several books before, but he felt that his main task as a poet still remained to be done. He writes in 1915, at a point when the Duino Elegies, so called because they were written in a castle called the Duino Castle, he says, everywhere appearance and vision came as it were together in the object. In every one of them, he's speaking of the Spanish landscape, a whole inner world was exhibited. It was as though an angel, in whom space was included, were blind and looking into himself. Let me repeat that image again. Looking at the Spanish countryside, Rilke, who is pregnant with this marvelous group of elegies, says that looking at the countryside, in every one of them a whole inner world was exhibited, as though an angel, in whom space was included, were blind and looking into himself. This world was no longer regarded from the human point of view, but as it is within the angel. And that is my real task, one at any rate in which all my previous attempts would converge. I read now from the introduction by J.B. Leishman to the translation which was made by him and Stephen Spender of the Duino Elegies. A beginning with this task had been made during the winter of 1911-12. In October, Rilke visited his friend Princess Marie von Thurn near Trieste, and from her departure in the middle of December until her return in the following April, he remained in the castle alone. One day he received a troublesome business letter, which required an immediate and careful answer. To settle his thoughts, he went out into the roaring wind and paced to and fro along the bastions, the sea raging 200 feet below. Suddenly he stopped, for it seemed that from the midst of the storm, a voice had called to him. Wer, wenn ich schreie, hörte mich denn aus der Engelordnungen? Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? Taking out the notebook he always carried with him, he wrote down these words together with a few verses which seemed to follow of their own accord. He knew that the God had spoken at last. Quietly returning to his room, he dispatched the troublesome letter, and by the evening of that day, the first elegy had been written. I quoted the opening lines of that elegy to Rabbi Steinsaltz, and I said, it is quite clear that although Rilke speaks in the same kind of idiom that you speak in, I was able to read his book, but not yours. And the reason was that for Rilke, angels are ways of talking about human realities, admittedly of a high and sophisticated order. But for you, angels are substantive beings. Moreover, I said I would like to read a commentary on that poem. When Rabbi Steinsaltz heard that, he said, I wish somebody would write a commentary on my works. I said, if it wasn't so difficult, perhaps somebody might try to write a commentary on your work. Here we have a letter which Rilke wrote to his Polish translator on the issue of angels. The angel of the elegies, which appears over and over again, has nothing to do with the angel of the Christian heaven. And of course he means also the Jewish angels. The angel of the elegies is the creature in whom that transformation of the visible into the invisible already appears complete. Already appears complete. The angel of the elegies is the being who vouches for the recognition of a higher degree of reality in the invisible. Therefore, that angel is terrible to us because we, its lovers and transformers, still depend on the visible. He then goes on to say that the angel may be described as an hypostasis, which means the deliberate making of a thing out of something which is not a thing. Hypostasis of the idea of a perfect consciousness of a being in whom the limitations and contradictions of present human nature have been transcended. We don't have time to go into Rilke's idea of angels right now, but I just wanted to make it clear to you, as I did to try to him, that here we have a modern poet who speaks of angels throughout a very important series of poems, who describes his ability to write the poems in the first place as a result almost of a revelation from God, in which he felt he was speaking to angels, a voice from the storm, and yet at no point does he leave those of us who believe in what, for want of a better term, I could call the modern or the postmodern spirit. That is to say, he does not demand that we believe in the existence of supernatural beings. One of the people who speaks frequently at Radius Institute discussions is Peter Berger, with whom Steinsaltz had an equally apparently ineffective debate some months ago. The two men are interesting, and those of you who know something about Peter Berger will know that he too flirts with angels. He wrote a book some years ago called A Rumor of Angels, as if to indicate not that he believed in angels, but that he heard some sounds in the night. Steinsaltz insists that there are angels. I would describe the two men in this way. Steinsaltz is totally in supernaturalism. Berger has one foot in supernaturalism and one foot in naturalism. He's a sociologist. If he took both feet out of naturalism, he wouldn't be able to continue being a sociologist. Well, he could, but it would be rather difficult. One wonders, however, whether Berger is comfortable with one foot on both sides of the boundary line that separates supernaturalism from naturalism. One almost might add, in all honesty, that Rabbi Kaplan also spent most of the latter decades of his life with one foot on either side of the fence. That is to say, his creation of the term transnaturalism, something which is naturalism but which isn't supernaturalism, but somehow satisfies both one and the other, is an attempt to do something which Berger spells out more clearly in Rumor of the Angels, which you will be able to understand more clearly if you read both Rabbi Kaplan's writings and Rabbi Berger's writings. So don't say I didn't tell you where to go to find a further understanding of the point that we're making. In fact, Reconstructionism, both in its liturgical creations and in the corpus of Rabbi Kaplan's writings, never comes clearly down on the side of naturalism. That was left to the last 20 years at the SAJ. And I'm not sure whether in doing that we haven't omitted the angels. This is a different topic we're going to try to touch on very briefly this morning. So, the second salvo came from the opening chapter of a little book by C.G. Jung called Answer to Job. Venerable reader, Jung writes, I am speaking of objects of religious belief. Whoever talks about religious belief inevitably runs the risk of being torn to pieces by the two parties who are in mortal conflict about those very things. This conflict is due to the strange supposition that a thing is true only if it presents itself as a physical fact. Thus, some people believe it to be physically true that Christ was born as the son of a virgin, while others deny this as a physical impossibility. Everyone can see that there is no logical solution to this conflict, as indeed everyone could see last Sunday that it was a waste of time to have a supernaturalist and a naturalist discussing angels, and that one would do better not to get involved in such sterile disputes, which is how I would characterize last Sunday's discussion. Both are right and both are wrong. You see, the more I told Rabbi Steinsaltz that his angels were incompatible with the way in which intelligent people in the 20th century look at reality, he kept on telling me that the way in which modern people look at reality is incompatible with the universe of discourse in which he knows that there are angels because he meets them. And those of you who took Philosophy 1 will know that there is no way of resolving that impasse. There is absolutely no philosophical way known to the human race of solving what happens between a capitalist and a communist when their axioms are radically different. There is no philosophical way of bridging them. There's no way of proving to somebody that, you know, why shouldn't I meet an angel in Central Park when I'm jogging? It's not just a question of I would be surprised if behind a forsythia bush an angel suddenly marched forward. The fact that we really believe that it's incompatible, that's the crucial thing. We think that we Reconstructionists know the truth, but we don't. We simply have another belief, which is different from the orthodox belief. And we do well not to go around prating that we have the truth and all the others are wrong. Although the number of occasions in the past 60-odd years that this pulpit has heard said that somehow Reconstructionism knows the whole truth and nothing but the truth is very difficult. We do try to qualify that from time to time. We happen to like being here, hopefully, otherwise we'd be somewhere else. Ultimately, it's what we like to do and what we like to be. There is no way of demonstrating the truth of Reconstructionism. There is no way of disproving the futility of supernaturalism. We would better learn some humility and endeavor to understand what this business of angels are about. To continue with Jung, yet they could easily reach agreement if only they dropped the word physical. Physical is not the only criterion of truth. There are also psychic truths, which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. For example, if a general belief existed that the river Rhine had at one time flowed backwards from its mouth to its source, then this belief would in itself be a fact, even though such an assertion physically understood would be deemed utterly incredible. Beliefs of this kind are psychic facts which cannot be contested and need no proof. Religious statements are of this type. They refer without exception to things that cannot be established as physical facts. If they did not do this, they would fall into the category of the natural sciences. Taken as referring to anything physical, religious statements make no sense whatsoever, and science would dismiss them as non-experienceable. They would be mere miracles, which are sufficiently exposed to doubt as it is, and yet they could not demonstrate the reality of the spirit or meaning that underlines them, because meaning is something that always demonstrates itself and is experienced on its own merits. The spirit and meaning of Christ are present and perceptible to us, even without the aid of miracles. Miracles appeal only to the understanding of those who cannot perceive the meaning. Let me skip the rest. The fact that religious statements frequently conflict with the observed physical phenomena proves that in contrast to physical perception, the spirit is autonomous. Psychic experience is to a certain extent independent of physical data. The psyche is an autonomous factor, and religious statements are psychic confessions, which in the last resort are based on unconscious, that is, transcendental processes. Then, of course, Jung does go on to say, well, yes, but is there anything behind the psychic reality? That is to say, I may believe that God revealed the Torah on Mount Sinai, and the fact that I believe it is a psychic reality which has to be reckoned with. However, is there any truth value in that statement? Did it really happen? Now, here Jung again does the Kaplan and Berger game. After all, we can imagine God as an eternally flowing current of vital energy, etc., etc. He says, all that we know is that the ideas that we have are dependent on human imagination and its temporal and local conditions, which have therefore changed innumerable times in the course of their long history. That sentence, by the way, sums up about half a dozen of Peter Berger's books. There is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles or archetypes. But these, like the psyche itself, or like matter, are unknowable. All we can do is construct models of them, which we know to be inadequate. So he says we don't know what the unknowable is. We don't know what the ineffable is. So Jung still leaves open the possibility that maybe there is something behind the image of revelation, beyond the fact that it is psychic reality. That is to say, granted that religious beliefs are psychic facts, they have a reality of their own. Is there anything behind them? Berger says maybe. Steinsaltz says yes, and I said no. And that's where we were stuck last Sunday afternoon. Now, I took the New York Review of Books to the office on Monday because since I wasted 3 hours on Sunday afternoon trying to do the impossible, I didn't have time to do my usual chores. Imagine my distress when I read this article by Anatole Boyard. I will read a short extract from it in a moment, but only to add that Monday morning in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article called "How It's Logically Possible That Angels Exist." You may want to know why I know what was written on Monday morning, March the 29th, in the Wall Street Journal, when I never read the Wall Street Journal. For that, angelic hypotheses are called for, which I can't possibly entertain at this moment. However, the article is by Edmund Fuller. I will read just a brief extract from it. Forget that pinhead. The myth that intense discussion focused on the number of angels that might dance on a pinhead is simply one of the many modern inventions contrived to make a mockery of medieval thought. Such a question never occupied the attention of a single thinker in the Middle Ages, when angelology was so fully developed, nor was it among the disputed questions that scholastic theologians and philosophers have been traditionally supposed to wrestle with in endless, fruitless debate. Nevertheless, it was one of the questions most persistently asked of Mortimer J. Adler by persons hearing that he was at work on his latest book, The Angels and Us, published by Macmillan, 205 pages for $11.95. His title is well chosen, for people in general, while often ambivalent, confused, or contradictory in attitude, continue to feel a fascination for the subject, in no way affected by the heterodox beliefs of the persons, or diminished by the absence or denial of any religious belief, which might explain why the Jew who had bacon on Saturday morning as his way of observing Shabbat Menucha attended Steinsaltz's Talmud seminar for several months in order to learn more about Noah and the flood. Angels are inseparable from the faiths of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Let me repeat that, dear Reconstructionists. Angels are inseparable from the faiths of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. See, I would agree with that. I too believe in angels, but as psychic realities, not as something one discovers, but something which is a projection of some very rich and exciting things which go on both inside the individual human being and also in the collectivity. But Steinsaltz wants more than that. He wants acknowledgement that they exist beyond that point in some kind of substantive reality. And that I will not concede. At least not right now, but perhaps, who knows. And in some manifestations, from just about all modes of religious or supernatural beliefs, ancient or modern, primitive or advanced. Mr. Adler lectures on many topics at Aspen and elsewhere, but the subject of angels draws the largest audience. His approach in this book is philosophical, not religious. He undertakes to show not that angels do exist, which he leaves up to us, but that it is logically possible that they do. He then goes on to say, when the late Senator William Benton, when publisher of the Encyclopedia Britannica, was flabbergasted by Adler's choice of angel as one of the great ideas of the Syntopicon. Some of you may know the great books of the Western world, a horrible, monstrous collection of books, which some of us were stupid enough to buy at one stage and never used ever since because it's impossible to use the index properly. But at any rate, there is a Syntopicon, which is a general index, and in there is the word angel. And you can find, if you are so disposed, references to angels over the last several thousand years. Mr. Adler recommends two other excellent books, Angels by Peter Lamborn Wilson, published in 1980 by Pantheon, and A Dictionary of Angels, published by Macmillan in 1967. Now, I don't want to go on beyond this point because, although it's very interesting, he draws our attention, of course, to the fact that we have angels in Milton, and in C.S. Lewis, and in Charles Williams, and in J.R.R. Tolkien, who told the author of this review that his heroic wizard Gandalf is an incarnate angel. I wonder whether we Reconstructionists talk to each other too much and don't listen to the whispers that come in from outside. A lot of interesting things are going on outside, and we're still busy telling everybody in a few bald sentences that we don't believe in anything worthwhile. We don't believe in this, and we don't believe in that, and we don't believe in the other, and that's the beginning and the end of Reconstructionism. I'm wondering whether any purpose is served by using these slogans anymore. I think they sell us short. I think the complexity of Reconstructionist thought on matters spiritual cannot be summarized in a brief Madison Avenue, consummate, exquisite statement that can be published in the New York Times in the middle and sort of induce people to go out and buy books. Perhaps we have deluded ourselves into thinking that some of the complicated matters which our ancestors spent decades and centuries and millennia on trying to understand cannot be simply resolved by the glib statement, we are not supernaturalists, or Reconstructionism is Judaism without supernaturalism. That somehow it is an insult both to the past and those intelligent people in the present, because there's one thing about Dr. Steinsaltz. He is a Renaissance man. He is as equally at home in modern mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology as he is in the world of the Talmud. One does not simply reject the views of such a one as being inept or meaningless. And indeed, I did not do that. I did say at the end that I regretted that we'd wasted our time, because obviously none of us were going to convince the other, and I would have much preferred either to have davened mincha with him, he liked that idea very much, or that we should have studied a text together, as, for example, was done at the Y some months ago, when three rabbis coming from different backgrounds were able not to discuss theology, which was impossible, but to study a text. And in fact, the Radius Institute is trying to find some unsuspecting rabbi, they may come back again for all I know, to study a text with Rabbi Steinsaltz. He is a man to be reckoned with. However, what really disturbed me, and also made me rejoice, and I wish I had read this article by Breuard before meeting with Steinsaltz, because then I think maybe we would have got closer, or maybe I could have wrung at least some kind of a concession from him, that even Reconstructionists can talk about angels without any embarrassment whatsoever. Breuard starts by quoting a book by a woman called Annie Dillard, whom I've never heard of before, but on the strength of this brief quotation, I've ordered the book this week. She's just written a book called Living by Fiction. And in that book, she says that the most extreme, cheerful, and fantastic view of art to which I ever subscribe is one in which the art object requires no viewer and no listener, no audience whatsoever, in order to do what it does. which is nothing less than to hold up the universe. I did a double somersault. This is pure Lurianic Kabbalah. Pure, unadulterated Lurianic Kabbalah. Expressed in an idiom that I can understand, and moreover, which I accept and believe in. The minor British diplomatic representative in the wilds of Africa at the end of the 19th century, who, while the natives were beating on their tom-toms ready for the next cannibalistic sacrifice, nevertheless took his shower at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, dressed in white tie and tails, and lifted his glass of sherry impeccably dry to the picture of Queen Victoria, whom he toasted at precisely 6 o'clock every evening, represents something of what we're talking about. The people who got out their musical instruments and played as the Titanic was sinking represent something of what we're talking about. But they had an audience. The notion that the Germans believed in, the Nazis, that if you take a human being and take him away from every human contact and put him in a building of 12 feet thick walls of cement so that nobody can hear his cry and nobody can hear his prayer, and then you torture him and then you kill him ignominiously, that somehow you can take away the essential humanity of man. The Nazis understood the meaning of angels. They understood the meaning of angels the way the devil knows about the meaning of God. The Nazis knew the inverse implication of the idea of angels. They knew how to act in such a way that by acting in the way by which they tried to take away from human beings certain basic human spiritual rights, they affirmed the existence of this kind of angel. Because nothing is ever wasted, even a silent prayer which nobody ever hears. Miss Dillard bases this notion, I continue with the quotation from the New York Times, on an idea of Buckminster Fuller's, that it is the function of man to oppose the tide of entropy described in the second law of thermodynamics. The rampaging disorder of the physical world, Mr. Fuller argues, is balanced by man's creation of imaginative or metaphysical order. Remember what the Lurianic Kabbalists say about the performance of a mitzvah. Hineni muchana muzuman, I am ready and prepared to eat this matzah, to recite the blessings over this matzah in such a way that if I do it properly, it will affect the nature of the cosmos. I did not know that Rabbi Buckminster Fuller, Buckminster Fuller, we've just given him a rabbinical diploma, had the same idea. Thoughts count, Miss Dillard says, under the influence of Fuller. A completed novel in a trunk in the attic, which of course nobody has ever read or will read, is an order added to the sum of the universe's order. It remakes its share of undoing. It counteracts the decaying of systems, the breakdown of stars and cultures and molecules and the fraying of forms. As it happens, I was talking just the other day to a writer who holds the same view. He said to me, you know, I used to write for people, and my reward was a confetti of rejection slips, or an occasional acceptance for a magazine with a name like a rock group. But even if I had been published in the New Yorker or the Atlantic, what difference would it make? A few bucks? What can you hope for from people? Think of the notion that I mentioned before of a book by Steinsaltz, which is published by Basic Books. Now, if I can't understand it, I hope I'm not being immodest in suggesting that there are a few other people around who also can't understand it. All of a sudden, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. He could have written a manuscript and put it in a box in his attic. There, it would have performed steadily. Maybe there's a carbon radioactive waste factor involved in a novel. How many years does it, Avi, you may help me here, how many years does it take a good novel to dissipate if nobody ever reads it? I mean, is it like, you know, where the chemicals were there? How parochial to write for people! How limited, how small people are! Writing for people is like shouting into the wrong end of a megaphone. Now, I go to the source. I hurtle right over their heads and address myself to the world. As Hamlet says, I conjure the wandering stars and make them stand like wonder-wounded hearers. I've got a real audience at last. Generous, warm, receptive, immense. Every line I write is a ripple that travels to infinity. I almost died at my desk. I choked when I read this line. Oh, Steinsaltz, I said, pity me, thou poor bleeding piece of earth. How could I have argued so much with him the day before when in Broyard's words, of course I presume this man he met on the street is a fictional creation of his mind, but it doesn't matter. If he'd only written a story like this, I would have become a devout believer in his angels. He was talking to me about 16th century angels. I want a 20th century angel. You may not be an angel. Do you remember that one? Anybody remember that one? Because angels are so few. But until the day that one comes along, I'll string along. Don't we know that? My God, I think we need a lot of invitations to the Seder service through Dorot this year. You never know that song? Nobody ever heard that song? One of my favorites. Every line I write is a ripple that travels to infinity. I'm going to write a paragraph. You make a bracha over it. And the ripple goes to infinity. Every line I write is a ripple that travels to infinity. I've replaced an indifferent public with a passionate universe. What's a bestseller next to that? Think of the challenge, the dilapidations all around us, a havoc of exploding, colliding planets. And only a man with a pen in his hand can put it all back together, can rewind the great clock of the cosmos. Think of acid rain, yellow rain, the pollution of our oceans and rivers, the depletion of our fuel sources. Think of the frescoes flaking in Italian churches. Think of Venice sinking, great ocean liners rusting, blocks of abandoned tenements in the Bronx. It's a man-sized job. When I open the paper in the mornings, I see nothing but cries for help. Floods, cyclones, earthquakes, forest fires. And I take these as assignments. I sit down at my table to do battle with this mischievous perpetual motion machine. When I start writing, I can sense, as Fuller says, the intellect taking the measure of energy, the physical tending to be disorderly, and the metaphysical apprehending, comprehending, and putting together. Just listen to that. Apprehending, comprehending, and putting together. There's a definition of art for you. Show me a literary critic who can touch it. On a really bad day, when there's a kind of cosmic vandalism in the air, I try to write strict stuff, a maximum of order, sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, heroic couplets. I see these as emergency measures, stitches in the great gashes of time and space. Other days, when the demolition is comparatively mild, I can hang loose with blank or free verse, dithyrambs, odes, aubades. I might even try for a belles-lettres essay, a short story, a few pages of a novel. The writer paused, as if he had suddenly come upon a black hole in the space of his ambition. I felt a rush of sympathy for him. You've taken on a rather large responsibility, I said. Does it ever intimidate you? Yes, indeed, he said. There are times when I think that entropy is winning, when I can actually feel the universe coming down on me, pressing, as if the ceiling of my studio were falling in, like these bombing victims in the war who were buried in rubble. I have to dig myself out, but I can't quit. I've got to keep going. It's not like writing for people. With people, when you're writing for people, if you miss a few weeks, they'll muddle through. But man, you turn your back on the universe, and the whole damn shebang will come down around your ears. When it starts getting to me, I think about my novel in a trunk in the attic. I don't have an attic, so I keep it in the house of some friends in the country. It's not a big trunk. In fact, it's an old footlocker I found in an Army-Navy store. But it's big enough. I can feel my book pulsing in there, beating like a heart against the turbulence. And I say to myself that I've done what I can. I've taken the heat. Though nobody has actually read my novel, I've shouted it to the heavens, and I know I was heard. The writer looked up as if he could see his work ascending. Like an angel, I added that. We were walking along a street on the Upper West Side. Where else would one see angels, if angels in fact exist? And he paused to gaze around, as if he was measuring the order and disorder in our immediate neighborhood. It's a tough life, he said. in so soft a voice that he might have been talking to himself. But once you take it on, you can never be satisfied with less. This is a curious kettle of theological fish we have here this morning. We start with a man who insists on speaking of angels in the idiom of 16th century Lurianic Kabbalah. That if you recite the brachot over the matzah in the right frame of mind, you will change the cosmos. You will actually affect tikkun olam. You will, in an immeasurably small matter, improve the quality of the cosmos. And if you don't, you will perform what is known as a pagam. Some flaw, however small, will enter the cosmos. In one of Aldous Huxley's novels, and never forget this, I don't remember which of Aldous Huxley's novels. Does anybody read Aldous Huxley's novels these days? Aldous Huxley? Oh, what a shame. Wonderful novel. There's a man who's in a villa on the top of a hill in Tuscany. He always writes about these resplendent mansions in Tuscany where nobody works and everybody just sits around talking and drinking wonderful sherry all day long. And this man is smoking a cigar, and he's poised at the point when he's lighting the cigar. And he strikes a match, and Huxley, the man who understands the meaning of angels, says, and the temperature of the hillside imperceptibly grew for a brief moment. That's Lurianic Kabbalah under a different disguise. That is to say, you strike a match, there is heat, we know there's heat. If you don't believe it, just try to put a lighted match in your hand, or even after the light has gone out. Does it affect the heat in the cosmos? Well, apparently all these underarm deodorants may destroy the world yet. A spritz here and a spritz there, and the ozone layer goes. You see, the trouble with moderns is we don't believe anymore in the power of the single act. We don't believe in the power of the little. Everything is big. And maybe one of the things that Rabbi Steinsaltz reminds us all about, including me, especially me, is that the way in which we get back to a sense of the measure of the power of the spiritually small, which ultimately is the power of the spiritually great. In matters that count, it's quality and not quantity. He who plays the numbers game defiles the meaning of the angel. At our Seder services this week, we will be faced with, some of us will at least, who don't have the traditional text in front of us, as I will, with the Reconstructionist Haggadah, which was so convinced that angels are of the past, and presumably the psychic dispositions that they reflect. There is no mention in the length and breadth of the new Haggadah, as far as I have been able to look through it, in which a reference is made to angels. However, in the traditional Haggadah, which I think ought to be on the table even if you don't read it, simply because of Buckminster Fuller. So if you don't do it yourself, do it for the sake of the second law of thermodynamics. It's important to have a traditional Haggadah on the table because it will emanate something. Maybe it will even improve the quality of the gefilte fish. You never can tell. Spiritual things work in strange ways. I redeemed you from Egypt, God says in traditional Haggadah, lo al yedei malach, velo al yedei saraf, velo al yedei shaliach, ela hakadosh baruch hu bichvodo uviatzmo. I regret that Rabbi Kaplan saw fit to omit that sentence from the Haggadah. The reason clearly was the same reason that prompted the editors of the old Encyclopedia Judaica to omit all references to mysticism. If you compare the old Funk and Wagner Encyclopedia in our library upstairs with the Encyclopedia Judaica, which bears the imprint of all the articles on mysticism by Gershom Scholem. And there are hundreds and hundreds of folio pages in which you can learn about the topic that I'm talking about this morning. This sentence is crucial to an understanding of what Haggadah and what the Seder is about. Normally, God's tasks are performed by angels. But the redemption from Egypt, the Haggadah says, was not performed by an angel. The word for angel in Hebrew is malach, which means messenger. And in case we miss the message, the Haggadah repeats, v'lo al yidei shaliach, which means a messenger. V'lo al yidei saraf, which comes from the word to burn, namely a fiery creature of the imagination, or as Rabbi Steinsaltz no doubt would still say, some external fiery being. God himself redeemed the Israelites from Egypt. Now that's a very heavy statement. It's easier for us to understand how the redemption could have been done by angels. It's a central problem in theology. Some people are so upset by the problem of how a spiritual, eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God could have sullied his hands with the work of creation. You don't do that. It's like asking the head of IT&T to sit at the switchboard while the secretary goes out for lunch. You don't do that. God has to have a demiurge, some sub-creator, some theological celestial foreman who does the work for him. How can God create the world? Theologians ask. Surely it has to be done through intermediaries. Even the Jews were subject to this notion. In Platonic idealism, which we find in Philo, the notion of emanations, that God is spiritual, but the actual work is done by people who have a mixture of the spirit and the flesh. But the Haggadah tells us something different. Never mind how can God create the world. God redeemed the Jews from Egypt. If the creation of the world is regarded as trivial, what importance can we give to an episode which took place in the 13th pre-Christian century for a ragtaggle bunch of nomadic gypsies? The Bible wasn't yet written. All which is Judaism was in the future. And we are to believe that the God who created the entire cosmos took time out, bichvodo uviatzmo. Methinks that a few moments devoted at the Seder table to a discussion of the issue of the meaning of angels in Jewish tradition, and perhaps even both Xerox copies of the article from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times would not make a bad introduction to those people who are always the bane of our existence, who never do anything Jewish throughout the year, but who turn up to families on the Seder night to get a brief potted version of the meaning of Jewish life in 35 brief minutes without too much interruption between the first glass of wine and the main course. It is an almost impossible task. Perhaps if we try to blend the best of the past, which I think today we can say honestly, in spite of the new Haggadah, includes those metaphysical statements which perhaps were incomprehensible 50 years ago, but begin to become more comprehensible today. Now, lest I be misunderstood, I am not saying that Reconstructionism should go back to supernaturalism. I am insisting with every ounce of energy I can summon that Reconstructionism must give up this silly game of talking about what we don't believe in and begin to wrestle with the realities, the psychic realities of supernaturalism, which are still there. It makes little difference for us whether there is something behind or not. What is important is that those expressions of angels and gods, and the God who redeems by himself and not through the means of messengers, are projections of the human mind, individual and group, which we ignore at our peril. There is a thinness to the gruel which is served up as modern religion. We need a good old bone of thick pea soup, something that's got a few bones in it, something that's got a bit of marrow, something with real meat. I'm tired of all these thin, watery soups of spiritual satisfaction which neither satisfy nor give spiritual comfort. We must get back to the substance of reality. When I was a child, my father told me that if I watched the cup of Elijah very carefully, when the door was opened and we said, Shfoch hamatcha al hagoyim, God destroy the heathen who just kill Jews for the hell of it, which is also unfortunately missing from the Reconstructionist Haggadah, which although it was published after the Holocaust, simply couldn't entertain the real feelings that Jews have got to get in touch with about what happened to us in the Holocaust. Open the door, and what in the times of the shtetl was an act of courage, you said, may God destroy those heathen that for pastime over Easter beat up Jews. I still look at that cup. It always seems to tremble. My father said, when you see the cup shaking, that's because Elijah is taking a sip from his cup. He's a very busy man, and he has so many houses to visit on the eve of Passover that he only can stay for a sip. But watch very carefully. Maybe when the door was open, some wind came through, and there was a temporary ripple. but I know how fascinating it was to me as a child. And that image stayed with me throughout. Was it such a diabolical thing that my father did, violating a central Reconstructionist principle of teaching a child something about believing in Elijah as a substantive being who would come in through the door and sip the wine, which I would have to unlearn many years later at a penthouse overlooking Park Avenue, and the result of an article in Wall Street Journal and the New York Times Book Review? We have to think very hard before we throw away the past. Some of us don't even have enough of the past to make it worthwhile throwing it away. When people come to me and say, I want my child to have a Jewish education, we don't live in New York, where shall I send him to? This, that, or the other. I always say send him to the most traditional place. But why? We're not traditional Jews. I say it doesn't matter. Everybody has an obligation to give their children something they can rebel against. A young woman came to see me last week and said in as many words what I'm saying to you now. She said, my mother said to me a few days ago, I'm sorry we didn't give you anything to rebel against. I understand perfectly. Let us give our children this year at the Seder service a rich diet. And in case any of you needed a Reconstructionist dispensation to tell your children to watch the cup of wine to see whether Elijah is going to come by and take a sip, please tell the children to watch. And if they are in any doubt at all, tell them that Rabbi Miller will be watching. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.